My name is Jerome Ferry. My cameraman is Ellen Eggers. We're doing a video interview with Mr. Ted Johnson, who is the past co-founder of JTEX Associates Incorporated of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and at the present is chairman of the board. Ted, would you tell us when and where you were born?
Yeah, I was born in Fayette, Iowa, the youngest of 8 children.
What year were you born?
And I was born in 1924. So that makes me 76 years old.
Yeah. Were you on a farm?
No, we lived just across from the Upper Iowa campus, and it was always my single mother's wish that we all would matriculate through Upper Iowa, get a college degree. We all did except me, and I only spent 1 year there before the war.
Did you have a happy childhood? What you consider a happy childhood?
It was a depression, and nobody had anything, so there was no jealousy about that. You could get food out of the garden, plenty, and my mother was a great canner, so she could can endless jars of fruit and vegetables. So we never wanted for anything, and the Volga River was right through town, and you could swim in the Volga, go out to Big Rock and picnic. It was a fun time to be alive.
What did your dad do?
Well, he was, I'm told, although he left home when I was about 2, 3 years old, I'm told that he was a great butcher, and he worked for Smith's grocery store as a butcher, and as a result we got liver every Friday. Friday it was cheap, and they brought it home. But he left home when I was 2 or 3 years old. Very, very faint memory of him, but he was a carouser. He drank a lot of beer, and my mother decided that she couldn't have that influence on her children, all 8 of us. So she sent him away, and he came back one time, and my brother came down the hill and said, "Hey, your dad's up here. You weren't going to have supper." And all of a sudden I got to see him. That's the earliest memory I have of my father. And he told a story about having been in Fort Madison, and when he got freed out of Fort Madison, he was given a kind of a paper-like suit, and he got caught in the rain, and the sleeves came up to his elbows and the pants to his knees, and that's my memory of my dad.
Your mother, she must have had it pretty hard with 8 kids. Did you kids try to get odd jobs to make some money?
And the Depression, that was always available. You could go out and help the farmers mow hay and put it up in the barn. So forth. Addie Step grew melons out north of town, and you could go out and hoe melons. I mean, there was plenty to do. You didn't make much money, but it didn't take much money.
Yeah. And you had how many brothers? How many brothers did you have?
I had 4 brothers and 3 sisters.
Okay.
There were 8 of us.
Yeah. Did you? Were you interested in sports when you're?
Well, I grew up right across the street from the Upper Iowa campus, so old Doc Dorman was out there giving the boys heck, and I learned to love, really. Mother Luce's house was a football player's kind of house, and she put those guys up and fed them and bedded them down, and I was right next door, so I got to know all the great football players, Scoop Tate and all the Tate brothers.
So you grew up in a football atmosphere.
That's right.
Right across the street. So there's no doubt you probably knew you were going to go to college there someday.
Yeah. Well, I dreamed of it, and playing ball for Doc Dorman. But, when the war was over, and I came back, and then you could go. By the way, I went there 1 year and played for Doc as a freshman at Upper Iowa, and I had established myself as a potential regular. Played both ways in those days, defense and offense. But when I came home, the GI Bill was available, and everybody was trying to see where they ought to go. I went to Doc and talked to him, and I said, I'm thinking about going to Iowa because I want to get down, education down at Iowa. He said, you'll never make it down there, Ted. And so a friend of mine, Phil Logan, and I came down to Coe College and tried to apply and talked to the brothers, one of whom was a coach and the other helped. You may remember those guys. But anyway, my friend, who will remain nameless, my friend didn't qualify. His grades weren't high enough for their standard, and so they said, you can go, but he can't. We can't accept him. So I said, heck with you guys, and we went down to Iowa and matriculated down at Iowa together.
Did you ever get hurt playing football?
Well, that's spring practice. I was redshirted in the fall, and in spring practice we were in the stadium, and the coach was a doctor, so we thought he knew everything. And I got sandwiched by a guy from Des Moines who was an all-stater, and Earl Banks, who was a veteran down there. And they were doing 2-on-1 blocking, and I'm trying to hold those guys off, and they broke my leg. And Dr. Eddie came over, and he said, what's the matter, Johnson? And I said, I think I broke my leg. He said, well, why don't you go down to the shower room and get a pair of not stilts, but
crutches? Crutches?
Crutches, yeah. He said, get a pair of crutches and go over to the hospital and see if it's broken. Well, I learned to smoke cigarettes at the hospital because they were giving them out in the hospital, by the way. And I decided that I'd had enough of Dr. And the guy didn't know enough to send me in or help me over to the hospital. And he didn't come to see me, so that told me a lot.
So from there you went to North Dakota, didn't you?
No, North Dakota was in between. I lettered in basketball during the war. There was a program called A1 and A5 and A10, and you could take a test scores in high school, and then if you qualified and high enough, they sent you to this 812 program, ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program. So all of us went down to Fort McClellan, Alabama, in a battalion of bright guys, quite frankly. I mean, you had to have at least 135 AGCT. So they were all about the same caliber. We took infantry training and our platoon sergeant, or platoon lieutenant, was a guy named Fleming, who, by the way, was over age and grade, and we all volunteered in our platoon to go overseas with him right now if he could take us overseas. And they said he's over age and grade, so he can't take it. So we went up to school in Fargo, North Dakota. But anyway, Harry Fleming was a guy in the Korean War who was captured by the North Koreans. He was put in a camp where they had him, begged him to tell stories about how he was, why he was captured, and that he was mistreated and so forth. They wanted to tell him to belie the treatment that they got. And he refused to tell the story, and he said, "I'll only tell the truth." And so they put him in a urinal, an outside urinal, where the pursuer came down and battered his head and lit on his head. And he stood there for hours until, in the middle of winter, it was freezing cold, and he was standing in ice, frozen urine. He finally got surveyed, and Lieutenant Fleming was discharged without honor. And Carter, when he was president, finally gave him a discharge with honor. So he finally made it. But the guys that went to Korea, frankly, got a bum rap.
So
where were we?
Well, did you graduate from Iowa State then before you went into service? Or?
No,
Okay.
I went to North Dakota State for one semester, and we were obviously the only boys on the campus mostly, except for one guy, and we had a lot of girlfriends, and we went to the military ball, and it was a great event of the spring. And the colonel got up and at intermission, and he said, "I have an announcement." And he read the announcement, which was that we were all being assigned to the Rainbow Division in Muskogee, Oklahoma, and that the whole program was canceled. So there was a long pause, and finally a little applaud, and they hooped it up, and we were ready to get the hell out of that school and go back to the Army.
Is this, the Army is where you wanted to go?
Yeah, the infantry. Yeah. We were infantrymen, were proud of the blue braid, and when we got up to school, we felt like weren't in the Army, actually. So.
At this time, was your brothers already in service?
Yeah, they all went in ahead of me, and when I was down at Upper Iowa in the spring of 42, when I had reached the age in December of that year of 18, all my buddies got their draft notice, and I didn't get mine. And I went up to the West Union, hitchhiked up to West Union, which is 9 miles away, and went to the draft board and said, "How come I didn't get called?" And an old judge up there, who's head of the draft board, said, "Well, your 4 brothers are already in the service, and we'd kind of like to have you stay home, take care of your mother, and we understand your grades are very good down there at Upper Iowa, and we'd like you to finish school. We need to have some scholars as we need to have soldiers." And I said, "My mother can take care of herself, and but is there anything else?" And he said, "Well, your brother came up, and your oldest brother, and he was 31 years old, so he was right at the edge of the draft. I mean, when he could have been excused. But he'd been down to the Burlington Arms Depot, and he came up to volunteer to go in the draft if they'd leave me at home with our mother." And I said, "Well, that's awful nice of him, but is it mandatory that I stay home?" And he said, "No." And I I said, I got 4 good reasons why I go. My mother can take care of herself, and I got 4 brothers that are already in, and I want to be with them.
Would you like to show that picture of your brothers, Ted?
Yeah.
What's their names?
Well, it's
Can you see that?
Harold and Hod and Gene and Warren and Theodore, in that order. And we live 40 miles from Waterloo, where the Sullivan boys all died together.
Did they die prior to
no,
this?
None. Harold was wounded, but all the rest of us returned whole, and he returned whole.
No, what I meant was this: did the Sullivans pass away?
Oh, they were sunk in the ship.
Before you all joined the Army, or
No, it was after.
after? So you weren't
No, I
aware
had a
of what
guy over
possibly-
there who was a remaining son of 3 sons. And if you're a remaining son, you got shipped back out of combat. So Hank Hendricks from Indiana was in my squad. And about 3 days after we got in combat, he found out his brothers were killed, and they shipped him home. But we're always very sensitive to that, because except for Harold, the oldest, who suffered a very serious head wound, but survived, we all got home in good shape. And those Sullivans up there didn't make it at all.
Did you ever have an article in your hometown paper regarding the 5 brothers from Fayette?
Yeah, they put it in with a little heading, the 5 Fighting Johnsons, and somebody sent me a copy of the Waterloo Carrier up to when we were at Fargo, and it said the caption was the 5 Fighting Johnsons, and somebody took it and put it on the bulletin board, scratched off 5 and said the 4 Fighting Johnsons and Theodore.
So tell us explain the Rainbow Division to us, Ted.
Well, the Rainbow Division was probably the most notorious division in World War I, outside of the Marines at Belleau Woods, and maybe the 1st Division. The Rainbow was organized early in the war, in our entry into the war, from 26 states of the National Guard units, from 26 states in the District of Columbia. And MacArthur was a major at the time, and chief of staff or some title. And he said it stretches like a rainbow across the country, and that's where it got its name. Now, Iowa had the 168th Infantry, one of 4 regiments in Iowa was one of them. New York was one, Ohio was one, and Alabama was one. And then they had machine gun companies and all the rest of the cadre of squads of units in the Rainbow.
The Rainbow was a very highly recognized group.
And it was in World War I, very famous. And of course, we got a full dose of it. I mean, I can remember Eileen Ressler's dad coming to school when I was in the 5th grade and telling us we oughtn't to disarm. Disarming was hideous. And we grew up, I had a guy 4 houses down that had been gassed, and I can still hear his voice wailing as he suffered through it. In the early 30s, he was dead. But the Rainbow Division fought with the French and was a highly touted outfit in World War I. And they fought in the Champagne and the Meuse-Argonne and all the rest of the battles. And finally, MacArthur led them into Sedan when the war ended on the 11th And they were because they were from all the states in the Union, and because they had that name, they attracted a lot of attention. And they formed an organization called the Rainbow Division Veterans Association and invited us after we got in combat in World War II to join up. So 13,000 of us joined up. And we've been active ever since with the Rainbow. But this year we went over, since I talked to you the first time, we went over to France, and in the Uise Marne battle area, we saw where Joyce Kilmer got killed. He was a New York regiment guy. But he wrote, everybody remembers he wrote Trees, but he also wrote the Rouge Bouquet, which is recited every year, and I'm now the master of ceremonies of the Champagne Hour, so I get to recite that along with the comments. But we actually saw his grave. He's still buried in the American Military Cemetery over there, and put up a plaque in the Ames Marne area for all the troops that were in the Rainbow fought in that war.
So when you were shipped out, where did you go? Europe, the European campaign, or?
Yeah, we went down and summered down in Fort Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, and then we shipped out. And the D-Day had absorbed so many men that we really never got to go on maneuvers as every division is supposed to do. We got our maneuvers over in France, so we shipped out in the fall and went over. It was 3 or 4 months after D-Day, but that was when things were tightening up on the German border and in Belgium, and the Germans attacked in Bulge, the Battle of Bulge. So we got in time to test that out.
So it was kind of the mop-up of the D-Day invasion, or?
No, the Germans had attacked in the Ardennes, and the Battle of the Bulge, we got over there just as the Battle of the Bulge was breaking loose. So they threw us into the line instead of giving us unit training over there. We got put into the line right away. I was 20 years old on the 28th of December that year, and I was up on a dike overlooking the Rhine River, and on the other side were the Germans in the Siegfried line. We were in the Maginot line kind of area. And I saw a machine gunner digging in beside a pillbox over on the German side and zeroed in on him. I didn't zero in, I just fired 6 rounds for effect, and we started back to back and moved forward, and finally 9 rounds finished the German machine gun, and I got a call from the commanding officer of our regiment. Said, Sergeant, you got the first credit for the first German machine gun nest in Rainbow in World War II. So that's that was.
Was there a medal involved there?
No, hell no. But when the Germans failed to break through up north and really were stymied, they had another battle called Nordwind, which was one of Hitler's top aides, Heinrich Himmler, was in charge of that battle, and they called it Nordwind or North Wind, and they came down south along the Rhine River to try to flush us out and get around behind the Americans and the British up north in Belgium, and we stopped that. So that was the end of.
Was you in
German
infantry? Or?
Yes, I brought, oh boy, I brought the symbol of that infantry. Badges are, oh yeah, here it is. Badges are important, but none is important to an infantryman as the combat infantry badge. And that symbol is one that we cherish. I've saved this one for my grandson.
I know you're modest, Ted, but you were decorated with quite a few medals, like the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, 3 Battle Stars, Combat Infantry Badge. Could you tell us in what, why you earned these particular medals? Can you explain to us why you earned these particular medals?
Well, the Bronze Star, if it has a V on it, and mine doesn't, the Bronze Star with a V was for valor, and that was the first star that you could get. Subsequently, they gave everybody that was in combat, that actually was in combat, the Bronze Star. So if you were even in a unit that was in combat, even though you didn't do anything, maybe you were a supply guy or whatever, you got the Bronze Star. My Bronze Star was that kind of a Bronze Star. The Silver Star was another thing, and that was written up as a result of action taken at Würzburg when we were fighting Krauts and what was probably the most seriously defended town in all of Germany, save maybe Berlin. And my lieutenant said, "Come on, we got to go out and get this guy out of that tank." And there's an American in the tank in Würzburg. We went out to rescue him. And that's where the Silver Star came
The binoculars there, Ted, what's the story behind those?
from. Well, I usually have a piece of barbed wire, but in our initial combat in Kielstedt, France, where, by the way, there is now a plaque in honor of our assistant division commander, we went over as a task force before our artillery came, and in the era of the Battle of the Bulge, we were in Strasbourg vicinity, and the Germans were knocking on the door, and that was the end of the Maginot Line, kind of the tail end of the Maginot Line, and they had bunkers there, and we established, I was an 81 millimeter mortar observer, and I would go with the rifle troops to give them mortar support. And we had machine gun units in our company, and they went with the rifle companies. So I always went out as an observer for the 81 millimeter mortar, and we got sent up from Strasbourg on the Rhine, where I fired that 81 across the Rhine. We were told that there was a little bunch of ragtag Germans had infiltrated and come down from along the Rhine River, and were attacking our front and 8 or 10 kilometers away. So we went up to Kielstedt, and nobody was there to tell us what was going on. We were just being shoved into the battle. And we were looking for, we knew that the Krauts had come over in the town of Gamsheim. We were at Kilstead. And that was a pillbox there, the Maginot Line pillbox. So I got up in the turret of that pillbox, which has big gaping holes like that on the outside of the brass and iron, where they got tanks fired at it and so forth. But I got up in that piccolo where I could see the Krauts up there, and I saw them digging in, and all of a sudden a lieutenant came up from the E Company, and he said, where's the enemy? Well, we didn't know, and he didn't know, but I could see the Krauts digging in the town that was about a kilometer away across an open field, and they were digging in. And I said, take a look, and you'll see him over there. And I'm about to draw a call for fire. And I was ready to fire my 81 millimeter mortar on those Krauts that were digging in. And the lieutenant said, well, you can't fire mortars. We got orders to reserve your mortar rounds because there's no more than you got right here. And I said, well, I'm going to fire. And he said, you're not going to fire, Sergeant. And he pulled rank on me in that pillbox, and he started to fall apart. And I said, I don't know what you're up here, Lieutenant, for, but by the way, that's a place that's no bigger than that, so we're nose to nose. And I dug out my wallet and took out a picture of an old girlfriend I had at Upper Iowa. She didn't wait for me to get home. But anyway, I said, this is why I'm here. And he said, and this is why I'm here. And he dug into his pocket and he took out a wedding picture. He said, I got married 2 weeks before I shipped out. So that was it. And I fired and he took off and went otherwise. We were in Germany toward the end of the war. We were headed to Munich, but we'd been through Nuremberg and Schweinfurt and all the rest. And we got down to where we had to cross the river, and we were going down toward the turn that off, I'll remember what. So we were going up a grade, and off to the right there was a farmhouse, a big farmhouse, looked like a stable. And some of the guys fleshed out some Krauts, and they turned out to be Hungarian troops that were fighting for the Germans. But when they went by me, as we approached the top of the hill, I looked back and I said, hey, that guy's got a binocular. I'm going to go take it because I've lost mine. And I said, I'll be right with you, Captain. And by this time he was company commander. And the first sergeant and I was walking between them as we went up the hill, and I was going to support him with mortar fire, which was back probably 3 kilometers in the rear. So I went back and stopped the guy and took, he had his hands on his head, and I took it off his belt, which was behind him, and carried it, ran up to get to my assistant up there at the top of the hill, and just as we got to the top of the hill, the Krauts opened up with a machine gun and killed the lieutenant and shot badly wounded the arm of the first sergeant. And I'd been walking between them, and I figured that this saved my life, that ugly pair of binoculars.
You can imagine every time you look at that, it brings back a rush of memories for you.
Yeah.
Every time.
But I've found out the first sergeant's name, and I've corresponded with him, and he corresponded with the widow right after that, and actually paid her a visit when he got home. So it's not a bitter memory.
Was you in the vicinities of any of the concentration camps when you were over there?
Yeah, we were going, well, after we got across the Danube River, then and a canal that we had to go across, we were headed for Munich. And on the way to Munich, you run into Dachau. And we were not aware of that as troops. I mean, we just headed down toward Munich, and the Autobahn had been badly bombed, and so we had to do a lot of walking and carrying and stuff. But anyway, we were headed toward Munich, and all of a sudden we were routed to Dachau, a little town of Dachau, which was a picturesque town in Bavaria, and close to Munich. And when we got there, of course, the story is widely told of what we found. And we, along with the 45th Division, liberated the concentration camp.
At this time, you were not aware of what was going on at Dachau prior to this?
No, had no idea. And although you hear a lot of people that were in Dachau tell the story, about, I'd say 75% of them are just repeating what they've heard. And if I repeated what I heard and what I've heard since, I could tell you all the gore of the god-awful camp. But I went into Dachau and I said, hold up, we're now about 8 miles or 8 kilometers from Munich. And so we were on attention to duty. And some of the guys from my company actually went over to the camp, but it had been already liberated by the 45th and the 42nd Division.
What kind of an impact did that have on the rest of the troops when they come back and you found out?
Well, we heard about it and we reacted to it. And I had come all the way through Germany, and a lot of times it's just walking through a town, and the widows and the mothers would be out there with their kids in the sidewalk. You could hear them, babbling and talking as you went by, but you could smell the cooking. And boy, it reminded me of my mother. And as I saw these kids with their mother, I often thought of her. We came through Bavaria, where they have crucifixes, statues out in every place along where highways cross or where pathways cross. And I got the idea that we were liberating the Germans, not conquering them. And when we got to Dachau and heard the stories that the guys came back from the town of Dachau, it was about 2 miles over to the camp, it turned us into animals. And we didn't say a kind word to a German from that time until we ended up in Austria, which we were in occupation of Austria, the Rainbow Division. So
this photo here, Ted, is that?
yeah, that's in France. This is French, where I've gone back to Kielstedt several times, and that's a house. When we came out of the pillbox and were told to go over to another little town, the next day they had brought Moroccan French troops in to relieve us, and we were to go over to another town and attack in the morning. So we went back to the town that was this is in Kilstead, and we went back to the town in Lawasanaw where we were to sleep, and they put us in a barn. And all I remember about that barn was that we were up in a hayloft, and somebody lit a cigarette and caught the hay on fire. So when Bob Joy and I went back to Europe, 1969 or 70, I went back to this town with him and showed him where we had fought and what we'd done. And I came into the Lawasanaw and I said, "This is where we we slept in the haymow." And I said, "Keep your eye open for barns." And we just turned to go to Kilstead, the town that we really fought in. And there was a barn and there was hay sticking out of it. And I went in and talked to these folks and said I was here in 1945. And we slept in the barn. And they knew it. And they knew all about it. And they knew the hay caught on fire. And I've visited them probably 8 or 10 times in trips over there. Lawasanaw is a town just by Kilstead, but we put a plaque up in Kilstead on that pillbox, and when we come to town, they know we're there, and they couldn't be more gracious. And French are friendly people.
When you spent a winter over there, at least I know one winter. What was the living conditions like as far as for your troops?
Colder than hell. Well, that's easy, isn't it? It was colder than the North Pole. It was really the coldest winter they'd had in 50 years, and we've been back in the wintertime when it was 50 years later, and they still had a cold winter. But typically the ocean, Atlantic Ocean, warms up France enough so that it don't have that. But as you know from the movies and stuff, the bulge was cold, bitter cold weather. What was you housed in? Barns, tents? Yeah. In Kilstead, where we dug in, we moved over from Kilstead to Lawasanaw, but we were at the edge of the place, the town, and by the way, that reminds me of the story. But in Lawasanaw, we dug in on the edge of town, and we first went up to the dike, and they said you go up to the dike and you're going to take everything off your Jeep. But we carried the 81 millimeter motor on the Jeep, and you're going to go out there and you're going to fall off one at a time. The Jeep has to keep moving because you're in sight of the Krauts. And you set up right behind that dike and dig in. Well, we went up to the dike and peeled off one at a time. And of course, when you peeled off, you're in snow. And when you went up to the dike to get a look over at the town, you fall through the ice because the ice was not that thick. But it was colder than Billy be damned. One of our guys from Pennsylvania said, "Keep digging, you get down below the water line." And of course, that's impossible. But what brought me to that story?
We were talking about the winters.
Oh, yeah. And so my other squad leader had his own gun, and we dug a foxhole up on the dike beyond above the level of the water. And so we dug in on the dike, and we squat down, and he sat on the radio, so that our telephone, we had telephones at that time, and he sat on the telephone so that he couldn't get out. And I said, well, let's get out. And we tried to get out, and for the life of us, we couldn't get out. We had to dig into the side of that foxhole to get to, so we could communicate with her gun. But it was cold, and more people got trench foot than got shot.
Unbeknownst to you at the time, there was a German aeronautical scientist, Alex Lippisch, who had designed a Me-163 rocket plane. Did you ever see any of those rocket type planes?
No, I never saw any in flight. I've seen Doc's pictures of the original that he brought back from Germany with him, but I never saw. We were aware of the V-1 and the V-2 and the rest of the rockets that were going over to England.
So when Germany surrendered, where was your group at the time?
Well, we captured Munich, but there was a big sign on the city hall, "Welcome Liberators," and Eisenhower said, "To hell with that, take that down, and welcome conquerors is all right." And that's what we saw when we got into the middle of Munich. A lot of our guys stayed in Munich and picked up, that was Hitler's hangout. And anything that had Adolf or had a picture of a swastika on it was fair game. And a lot of my buddies paid their way through college and through home buying with silverware that came out of Adolf Hitler's quarters there in Munich.
You have a couple of mementos there yourself. Would you
Yeah,
like to tell
I
the
do.
story behind those?
Well, this when you saw what Himmler did in the Dachau unit, this was given to me by one of the lawyers who was a rainbower, who was in the Nuremberg trials as a lawyer. And John Smith was a lawyer, and this is out of Himmler's library. But this book, we went through Munich without stopping, because the roads were filled with liberated Krauts and liberated Frenchmen and all kinds of people. And they were throwing bottles of wine on our Jeeps, and guys were getting pretty well sauced. But it was not a battle. There were some battles in Munich, but very few. So, and the guy that took the surrender is a good friend of mine, but he was in a different outfit. But we went on through Munich and to the suburbs and toward Austria. We were headed toward Austria, and we stopped in a little cottage that looked like a honeymoon cottage. It had frescoes along the wall and hearts and flowers and all that stuff. And I said, well, that's my bed, the first one. I want to be sure I got a bed. We're going to hold up for the night. And I jumped on that bed, and boy, it was rocky. Well, I lifted up the mattress, and there underneath it, and they have little thin mattresses in those days, was this book of Mein Kampf, which was the only copy I ever saw in all of Germany or in Austria. And I had all of my squad sign it. It says snow fell on the 1st of May, and so did Munich. And then all the guys in my squad signed it. But I take this about when I go out and talk about Dachau and the Holocaust. This was given by the mayor, the Oberbürgermeister in Munich in the 1st of July in 1939 as a wedding present, which all of the Krauts got. And of course it had the picture of Adolf Hitler and for good measure. But that was a wedding gift that they got, and it's the only book I ever saw in all of Germany or Austria of the Mein Kampf. They must have buried him or burned him or whatever, but that was the only one I ever saw.
How do you suppose that could possibly have happened? With the German people not being aware of what's going on, or were they complacent or didn't care, or they believed so much in Hitler?
You have to read All's Quiet on the Western Front to really understand what happened in the 30s, 20s and 30s in Germany. That was such a terrible defeat, and Adolf Hitler was a corporal, as you may remember, in the German army. And that was so disastrous that if you read that book, you can't help but empathize with the guys as soldiers, that they ended up so beaten and so thrashed. But when they got back home, we didn't have a Marshall Plan in World War I. And in World War II, we had the Marshall Plan, and it's probably the greatest thing that we ever invented. And the Marshall Plan fed the Germans, treated the defeated people decently, tried to teach them democracy, and I think that it was just so debilitating defeat in World War I, and they lost so many of their brightest and best men that there wasn't any reserve for to take up the cause. We also think, and I hesitate to do this under the camera, but we think that the French, who lost so many millions of young men, paid the price for that victory in the fact that they couldn't stand up to the Germans. They built that Maginot Line and thought they were going to be safe. There was no spirit left in the French.
Did you get near his eagles, what he called his eagle's nest? Did you ever get near?
We saw it as we came down from Munich. It's over, you can see the mountains in Austria, in Germany at the border. And we saw it, but the war was over, and the 101st Airborne, by the way, took the actually occupied the Eagle's Nest. So I never got up there during the war. But the Austrians were another breed. They were beautiful and friendly. And we occupied them, and I stayed there from the end of the war until early in the spring next year.
So you didn't get to come home right away when the war ended?
No, I had 56 points, and that was April. So all the hometown girls had been tapped by older guys.
So what year were you discharged, Ted?
In 40, well, the war was over in 45. I got discharged in 46.
46. When you were in the service, was there a lot of segregation? The black Africans and the white soldiers? And
Yeah, and we trained in Fort McClellan, Alabama, which, as you know, in those days was pretty segregated, well segregated, or badly segregated, as the case may be. Northerners didn't take much pride in that, but we all had a little bit of bigot in us, probably. But I grew up in Fayette, Iowa, and my best friend was a Negro boy. The Basses, they were Portuguese, but they were swarthy enough to be considered blacks. And all of them did well, all of them matriculated well, and we're proud of them. But, and I grew up with Jews in Fayette that went to school with me, and I dated Jewish girls. So I was not a classic example of when we got down to Alabama, and you saw the whites and the blacks segregated in the restrooms and stuff, but we didn't take very kindly to that. But there were a lot of Southerners in the outfit that did.
Ted, I know you have a story to tell about Marlene Dietrich and the little statue there standing by the light post. What was that about?
Well, yeah. that's Lily Marlene, but she sang that along with See What the Boys in the Back Room Will Have and all the rest. But she was a German and came over during the 30s and became a star in Hollywood. And when we were going from Schweinfurt to Nuremberg, we were catching up with the front, and we'd been sidetracked in Schweinfurt. So we were route marching, and we came upon an MP that said, "Hey, you guys, detour." And we giving him the hubba and nonsense crap, and we were waiting for the war to be over. And he marched us around a cul-de-sac, and at the center of that cul-de-sac stood Marlene Dietrich in GI uniform, waving to us and throwing us kisses and waving. God, I never forgot it. I mean, she was actually up to the front and you could still hear artillery fire up in front of us. So, and of course the story of Lily Marlene just became one of her standards, because when our troops captured Czechoslovakia, Prague, they had that Lily Marlene record on the radio station, and they left it on so that all the GIs that were in Czechoslovakia heard that. And we stole it from the Germans, and it frankly made a hell of a lot of the German men angry that we stole their song, but it became our song. And later on, I was in Washington, D.C. for Collins Radio Company, and you had a modest expense account, and so you tried to entertain people. And one spring, or the first spring we were out there, we heard that Marlene Dietrich was down at the hotel, and she was at the outdoor pavilion hotel. So I got 4 tickets, or made reservations for 4, and nobody would go with us. So my wife and I went down. We got a table for 2 right by the kitchen door where the waiters and waitresses came out. And we waited. It was colder and pretty chilly out there, but anyway, in anticipation of Marilena, we all of a sudden they'd served us, and the kitchen door was banging and shut, and all of a sudden it went quiet, and out from the kitchen door came Marilena Dietrich in that gold lame dress that you've all seen, a wager that you've seen it. It was kind of a flesh-colored dress that she performed in. And she sat there and put her one leg up against the post behind her, not any further than I am from the camera, and sang Lily Marlene. And my wife said on the way home, she said, "I don't care what you think of her, but don't marry her if I go first." We tried to get in touch with her. She was over in France after the war, and we tried to get in touch with her to get her back to honor her at one of our reunions. And never could get to her. But
That kind of bring a tear to your eye?
yeah, it does.
I bet it did. I bet it did.
Yeah. When well, it does, and it did. But we sing Lily Marlene in German now at every reunion. So
Fabulous story.
yeah.
Okay, Ted, you were finally discharged, and you come back, and did you know what you wanted to do after you got out of the Army?
Well, I thought I was going to be an engineer. I never became one, but because I really had looked at law and insurance and other things.
Did you were you married at this time when you were discharged?
No, and my best friend came down. His mother had worked at Collins during the war, and maybe his sister, and so they lived down in Cedar Rapids, and I came down to visit with him, and we got acquainted with some folks, and that was a kid that was rejected by Co, and so we went down to Iowa and signed up and were accepted down there. So I spent a lot of time in Cedar Rapids because he really lived there.
Did you get an education in law? Or?
Yeah, they because of the number of military guys that they had there, they had a program where you could go 3 years and go into law school and get your BA for the first year in law school, and then 2 years more to get your LLB or JD. I used to tell the engineers that I was a Juris Doctor, and please call me doctor, because they all wanted to be called doctor, as you remember.
So when you got your degree in law school, where did you get your first job?
Well, I came down to Cedar Rapids and interviewed with a few guys in law, but the dean sent me down to Davenport, and I went down to Davenport. I had to buy a suit because my old suit was wrinkled and sad. So I bought a suit, headed down to Davenport, and I was interviewed by one of the main law firms, and still the main law firm in Davenport. And the dean had sent me, so I had good credentials. But they asked all kind of questions about what my mother did for a living, and I told them the truth. And, we'd been poor all our lives. And then they hinted around about my wife and what her father did. And I told them the truth, which is probably not a good idea if you're looking for a job. But I decided to tell them the truth, that my father was secretary and treasurer of Collins Radio Company. And my wife, we went out to the Cedar Rapids Country Club, and all the guys out there were wearing those black and white shoes. What the hell do they call them?
Saddle shoes?
Saddle shoes, yeah. And I said, this ain't for me, sweetie. I mean, if we're going to make it together, I'm not going to make it out here in Cedar Rapids Country Club, and frankly, quit playing golf out there as a guest of my father-in-law. But I never. Cedar Rapids was a kind of a cliquish town in those days.
Mm-hmm. What was your father-in-law's name?
S.J. Storm, and he was secretary treasurer of Collins Radio Company.
Mm-hmm. How long did you stay in Davenport?
Well, I didn't stay in Davenport.
You didn't stay in Davenport.
He later heard through the grapevine what I'd said down there. He wasn't very happy about it, but I said, well, I got to be honest.
Were you involved in the insurance business for a while?
Yeah, and it involves my father-in-law. The guy who was the state agent was down in Des Moines, and Charlie pestered me to get into the group insurance business because that was hotter than blazes at that time. So he said, maybe Collins Radio Company, I understand that they're going to review their insurance program. So I asked about it, and I was sent to the guy who was in charge of insurance. And he happened to work for my father-in-law by that time. And so I told Charlie, my state agent, that there was no communication. I didn't want him to talk to my father. I didn't want him to mention it to anybody, including the guy that he had to deal with. So on a Sunday before they made up their mind, this guy in Des Moines called my father-in-law. And my father-in-law called the guy who worked for him and was going to pick the agent, the insurance company. And he said, don't talk to him. They're out. And I had never challenged it. Of course, breached an ethic that should have been attended to. If I had gotten that, it was at that time there were 1,300 people or 1,400 people in Collins. It could have been about $1,000 a month commission. Mm-hmm. So I'd have been a hell of a good insurance man if he hadn't talked to my father-in-law on the phone. But I never resented it. I never regretted it. It was the way it ought to be.
Did you ever have any contact with your dad after he had left the family up in Fayette? Did you ever get to see him again later in life?
No, and that was kind of, I guess it was kind of a deference that my brothers and sisters had. But when he called to let my mother know that he was in a bad way and he'd like to see his kids once before he died. And I, except for that faint remembrance when I was maybe in the first grade, when he told about the sleeves of his paper suit closing down to his elbows. I didn't have any memory of him, but I'd been fairly successful in life and had proven to myself at least that my old man could have been proud of me. And they chose not to go down to the younger boys. So my brother and I, the youngest in the family, didn't get to notice. And I was in college. I'd always dreamed that I might one day walk down the street and see the old man and recognize him. And I'm going to be 6'2", taller than he is, and he'd be proud of me. But it wasn't to be.
It wasn't to be. You finally ended up working for Collins Radio.
Yes, and that's a psychic experience. I was living in...
Can you remember what year, Ted, first of all? 52 by chance?
Yeah, by chance. I told you that before. But I was living up in Oakland Gardens, and we had an apartment up there on the second floor. And I was carrying my daughter and the groceries up the stairs. My wife was with me. And I said, "Shirley, what time is it?" And she looked at her watch and said, "It's 5 to 6. And I said, "Remember that, because somebody's talking about us." And sure enough, we went up, and the next day I got a call from a guy named Neil Kavaznik. And he said, "I'd like to have you talk to you about coming to work for contract administration." And I said, "Well, have you talked to my father-in-law, frankly?" And he said, "Yeah, I took care of that. I went down Friday night and talked to him. He was just about to go over to the officers' club and buy the boys a drink, as was his wont. And he said, well, you can talk to him, but don't put me in the loop." And so he talked to me, and but I didn't find that out till later on. But anyway, it was a psychic kind of a thing that I remembered, and I've had 3 or 4 more since then.
So what was your position then in contract administration? Were you stationed here
I
in
was
Cedar
an
Rapids?
assistant contract administrator, which with a law degree, it was very helpful. I became a contract administrator shortly thereafter. And there was a fellow named Bob Gates that was running the business part of the company while Art Collins ran the development part. And Bob was pretty strict about how you wrote letters and who wrote letters and so forth. But Neil Kavaznik and Bill Graham was his boss. And one day they said, would you like to go to Washington, D.C.? And Bill Graham asked me that. And I said, well, he said, think about it, talk to your wife about it. Let me know what you think about that. And I went over, called my wife, said, we're going to Washington, D.C., are you with me? And she said, where you go, I go. And so I went back in and said, yeah, I'd like to go. And I would need $10,000 a year to go in there. And I figured it all out. And he said, okay. And So I went to Washington, D.C., and in those days, that was the first time that they had tried to negotiate on the spot, to have a guy out there that negotiated. So I became the negotiator of contracts, developed pretty good skill.
In that position, you have met quite a few of influential people, probably in government and commercial aviation both, didn't you?
Sadly so. Yeah, I met dignitaries all the time, military guys that had been great heroes in World War II. In fact, my division commander, named Harry Collins, was the division commander when we were overseas. I'd written him a couple of times to thank him for one thing or another. And but when he found out in Omaha, Nebraska, my first reunion of the Rainbow Division, that I might be coming to Washington, he said, well, good. He said he was now vice president in charge of amenities for a moving van company. And I met him in Omaha, and he said, when are you coming out? And I said, well, I'm coming out this November. Well, he said, who's in charge of moving you? So my division commander is, and I'm a staff sergeant under him, is using me as a way to get the moving costs done. But anyway, he was a guy, he was Harry Collins, and he had divorced his wife here in the States, so that the old guys in Rainbow resented him because they knew his wife and had known her well. So, but he got over to Austria, and he found a maiden over there that he married and divorced his wife. But anyway, I saw him come in with a charming blonde lady, and I assumed it was his wife, his second wife. He invited me to the Army-Navy Club one day, and I took, his name was Harry Collins, so I took Collins ashtrays, Collins lighters, Collins everything, pens and pencil sets, and I was ready for dare. And he got up at the time to go to the men's room and left me with his bride. And I said, Irma, I remember seeing you when we were at the theater and Bob Hope was there. She said, no, that was Inga. So I didn't make it too big a hit as a general.
Did you ever get a chance to meet Arthur Collins?
Yes, as a contract administrator here, I once or twice got invited to his open house, and of course he knew who I was. But the time I was in Washington, I'd been there, I went in 55 and came back in 60. I'd been there several years. He formed the Alpha Division, and the Alpha Division down in Texas. And they wanted me to take over their contract negotiation in Washington, and I told them no, I didn't want to do that. But I wanted to, I was used to Bill Graham and guys here. But I went to pick him up, Art Collins, up at Friendship Airport. which is, up in Baltimore. And I had an old car, an old, for the kids to ride in the back end. You could put it was really a 3-seater, and you could flatten it out.
The old beater.
So I said, well, I put all the trash in the back seat, the second seat, fishing pole and golf clubs and everything else. And I went to meet him, and he came in with the president of one of the unnamed airplane companies in Dallas. And he said, Ted, can you give him a ride? And I said, sure. And I bolted out to where my car was parked and put everything in the back seat. But I couldn't, I had a golf club that held the right front seat up, and I stuck it in there. And so I couldn't hide everything. Well, we went down to Washington, and at that time, the 9th Street and exit I got off of was blocked, and I ended up trying to feel my way down to downtown Washington. And I ended up in the blackest part of Washington, D.C. And it was no skin off my nose, but when I had to stop at a gas station and 4 or 5 of them came out to service my car, I could tell Art was a little disturbed that I didn't know how the hell to get downtown. So they gave me the route, and I ended up being able to go right down to the Mayflower Hotel. But it was blocked off.
You didn't make too many brownie points.
Oh, no. And the word came out that anybody who was going to pick up our columns in the future rents a car, a brand new car, and goes without. And that was the order. And I knew I was in trouble, and I knew it for sure. But I got even with it. Later on, when they tried to, Root House was taken over, and there was a different group, the old Cox and those guys who went down to pasture down in Dallas. There was a maneuver, a change of the guard, and I belonged to the old guys by that time. So they said, well, you got to go down to Dallas and be a contract man down there. And I said, no, I'm not going to go. My wife wouldn't want to go down to Dallas. We'd just go out to see the rapids. So anyway, and I came out here, and that's how I got tangled up with Roger Pierce. But I came out here to be with Roger Pierce's company, which is another story. But later on, I became well enough acquainted with everybody in Iowa that I was able to talk to the governor and directly and so forth. And I was putting on a pretty good front. And the governor had decided, Governor Ray had decided that he would name an engineer of the year and entrepreneur of the year and something else. And I got together with a bunch of the Collins old-timers and said, the guy that ought to get that ought to be Art Collins, first winner. So they said, well, why don't you write up that testimony? So I wrote up the reason why he was, and I went down and met with him and his new wife at that time, down in Des Moines, had lunch with him, went over, and they read the prescription, the description of why he was honored, and submitted by Theodore A. Johnson. He never batted an eye. He was gracious as he could be. But
What a coincidence.
I knew that my faux pas of driving an old car out there to pick him up was a mistake.
So, along about 1968, you and Mr. Joy got an idea.
Mm-hmm.
A couple young entrepreneurs. What instilled the idea into you, hey, let's start a company of our own?
Well, a fellow named Roger Pierce had started Hydrospace Systems Corporation. And he was a guy who believed that anybody but an engineer didn't amount to Tinker's Dam. I mean, he didn't hesitate to say that. And he always talked, when he had a little too much to drink, about the barrel, that what you ought to have is a barrel that you fill with money, paper money, but legitimate money, and just let the engineers come and take it out of the barrel, and whatever they needed, they do get out of the barrel. And he really believed that. And as you noticed in his writings, he hadn't written for quite a while, but he used to write all the time. He had an idea that money was not the judge, that the judge was the engineer. So, but I came out and interviewed with him and Arthur Barlow and Sud Cook and a couple other guys, and interviewed with him, and he was trying to get me to come out to be a VP of sales and so forth. And he took me on, and we ran into trouble because he had a fellow from Marion had financed him the first round, and he needed to get new financing, and that guy couldn't cover him. So he went to his board, and it was Arthur Barlow and Sud Cook and Jim Van Allen and 2 or 3 other dignitaries, and we needed $500,000, and they were ready. We met at Arthur Barlow's place, and he was ready to put the money in, and the team, funded. And Roger got up and made a speech about how the president is an engineer and the president is going to drive this airplane, and I just want you to be passengers. And they said, not on our funds. And that was the beginning of the end for Hydrospace Systems. He ultimately put the company in, well, he didn't put it in anything. He just took the files and hauled them down to the dump and dumped them on. So it was one of the aborted entrepreneurial startups that I ever saw. But I still see him occasionally.
So at this time, you and Mr. Joy.
But yeah, and Joy stayed with him during the interim until I could set up a company, and I set up J-Tech Associates, J for Joy and J for Johnson, J-Tech. And we decided that there was a market in oceanography, but it didn't include what Pierce had said, which was to put a whole bunch of platforms across the ocean to lead the navigation. And by that time, we had single sideband radios that, by the way, I sold the first batch of single sideband radios, the 18S4 and
618T.
68, well, no, it wasn't at 618 till later, but the 18S4 to the Air Force, and took them down to in the company airplane, the wooden axle airplane as they call it, and I took these 3 Air Force guys down there to see what we had down in Dallas, and they were going to buy a couple of $1 million worth of 18S's, and the down there, and we stayed at the hotel downtown, and we came out, we'd been out to that fancy store where you pay penalties, I don't even remember the name of it, still down there.
Neiman Marcus.
Neiman Marcus, that's right. And we'd been there, and they'd spent a little change there, I couldn't afford it. But we came back, and we had this big room, I mean, it was bigger and 3 times as big as this room, for which bedrooms were off to the side. And they had a bar there, so we all nipped a few things and said, let's go down and see what's downtown. So we went down across the street, and sure enough, right out of the hotel were 2 banners about girly dancers. So I said, well, we can go take our pick, and we went over there, and the one was kind of interesting, but the second one was the fan dancer, and she was the real McCoy. If you turn that off, I can. The other was Sally Rand, and so I said, well, we ought to go in there, and we went in and got a table for 6 or 8, a long table right up front. And the guy came over and said, I'll buy you a round of drinks, and here's a card for any of you that want to star to sign them. And it was a picture of Sally Rand and his legend on the back, so forth. So at intermission, she came and sat, and we had a round of drinks, and this old boy was sitting there, and he bought us a round of drinks, and we had a marvelous time with Sally Rand. Well, it was later, much later, that I'm back in Washington now with Collins. And on a Sunday morning, Jack Ruby was ushered out of the jail. I mean,
Transferring them.
he was in the crowd where they were transferring the alleged assailant. And
Oswald.
Jack Ruby, Oswald. And Jack Ruby stepped out and shot him, as you remember. And we were watching the scene on television. My kids were just young, and I hollered at Shirley, and I said, Shirley, that's SOB that signed us, got us to sign for the fan dancer down there. And damn if it wasn't Jack Ruby's
Business card.
business. Yeah. Yeah.
What a story. Back to JTEC. One of your primary products was the flow meter.
Yeah, still is.
Still is.
Mm-hmm.
This was used in oceanographic quite a bit.
No, actually, we got the idea from oceanography because, water, if you've been fishing, you feel your pant leg going back and forth, and that's the vortex sensor. And a fellow named Russ Colton and Bob Joy had decided that would make a real good way to measure because the vortex formation was a constant. I mean, it was function of the diameter of the strut and the velocity of the water and the density and some other things. And so we started there with the idea that we would not be in the flow meter business, but we would be in the airborne business. And we could have a measurement for helicopters and that sort of thing. And we did well with that. And then we decided that we would write to all the flow meter manufacturers and offer them a license to build flow meters with our technology. And we got a response from 24 out of the 25 people we wrote to. And none of them seemed adequate, so we said, what the hell, we'll go do it ourselves. And later on, that one person that had not done anything with us we had written to ended up being one of our best customers. But anyway, we built buoys that dropped from airplanes, and we were in the oceanographic business. Then we ended up going down to Collins Radio Company, and by that time, the new guy was in command. And I called in one morning because we were trying to develop, we had quoted Collins on some development of SATCOM equipment. And we sensed that the fact that we were ex-Collins guys was being held against us, because everybody said, although I don't think he ever said it, that was anathema to Arthur Collins that anybody quit. Well, a guy had quit and gone out east and doing single sideband radio by that time, and so I called a new manager of the, down there and said, we're down here talking to people about some airplane use of the anima technology. We're also talking to your guys up there about the SATCOM business. And we've heard that it's anathema to try to talk to Collins Radio Company if you're an ex-employee. He said, if you guys can do it, and you can do it for less cost than anybody else, then go to it. And that's how we got to by that time Arthur was not in command.
I understand you, at one time in 1990, you filed for Chapter 11 and you survived this?
Yeah, we came out of Chapter 11. Let's see. We were in First Trust down here in the Bohemian Bank, and they'd been very good to us, but they were bought out by somebody in Minneapolis. And they looked at overdue accounts, and we had one, but we also had $360,000 coming from one of the aircraft manufacturers, McDonnell Douglas. And if they'd have waited 2 or 3 weeks, we wouldn't have had to do anything. But they said no, and they were going to foreclose, and so we didn't have any thing that we could do, except that we'd heard that Norwest Bank was instituting a new debtor in possession program, and so that they wouldn't have to go through any of the bankruptcy chapters. And we called an Upper Iowa friend of mine and said, we'd like to be considered for a debtor in possession loan. And he came over with their guys, and we got the first debtor in possession credit line that they had ever done in Norwest, and we still bank with them, though they've been acquired by somebody else. But they offered us a $5 million line of credit. And really, $300,000 was all we needed ever, but we've survived it very well.
That's good. Throughout your career, I understand you helped 30-some different small companies start up.
Yeah, most of them have done better than mine for their people.
Why did you do this?
Well,
Is that Ted Johnson deep down? You want to help other people to?
I understood the government, and the government programs were the ones that mostly, seed capital had to come from people you knew, but the programs that Bob Ray instituted and later supported otherwise were programs that I was very familiar with, and I just helped guys write up their proposal, and many of them succeeded.
That was a very generous gesture on your part. I understand you kept very close with the Rainbow Division throughout your lifetime, serving on the board, and are you still active with the Rainbow?
Still active. I went over this fall. And,
you mentioned that,
But
yeah.
I'm the senior past national president now. I was the second World War II president, and the other chap passed away many years ago. So I'm the senior PNP, as we call it. We also started in 1970 an attempt we wanted to build a memorial down in Muskogee, which we did, and we started the Rainbow Division Memorial program, which now has a fund of about $500,000. So we've used that fund to build monuments, take care of monuments, place new monuments, all with a design to kind of keep the history of what they did in World War I and what, frankly, we did in World War II. Not aggrandizing ourselves, but the movement.
In memory of them.
Yeah.
I also understand you were the editor of the Peacock newsletter at the University of Iowa for quite a few years. This book here,
Yeah.
what were the Peacocks?
Well, the Peacocks got their name, it's legend, but the old-time Peacocks were guys that had played for Doc Dorman, as I did, by the way, the first year. And Doc Dorman was outside of Alonzo Stagg. Doc Dorman Doc Dorman was a unique guy. He was a dentist, and he told me when my teeth came in crooked that it'd work its way out. Well, they were crooked until I got them knocked out. But he was a legend in his own time, and remains a legend for Upper Iowa. So having grown up in Fayette and born in 1924, I was a darling of the football players and the basketball players and stuff. And in fact, the Tate's brothers, one of them shot one-handed set shots, and I copied him, and I almost got kicked off the high school team because I was shooting with one hand, but everybody shoots with one hand anymore. But and I knew the athletes and all of the people in Upper Iowa, and the girls that they dated, and most of them married. So they had a guy named Sweet Saugalid who started this a long time ago. He came back for homecoming in '63 or something. And there were none of his buddies there. So he started the Old Time Peacocks. And in 1990, he gave it up. He couldn't handle it. So I volunteered, and I've done it ever since, except the last one has gone on. And I said with tears in my eyes, I can't do this anymore. And frankly, the people that, I'm 76 years old, and everybody is kind of older than I.
Naturally.
But I've gotten so many letters back in appreciation of what I've done. They've been kind about it.
What's this photo of?
Did I tell you the story about Bill Andrews
Yes, you did.
and the applesauce?
No.
I didn't tell you the applesauce story. Well, Bill Andrews, my mother worked for their store. They had a grocery store.
Fine.
And Bill was the only child of the couple, and the Andrews. And he went to Upper Iowa. He was a year behind me. But I always let him, we picked a workup team. I'd always pick him because nobody wanted him. Because he wasn't an athlete, he was an entrepreneur himself. But anyway, we traded stamps, and he had accumulated a pretty good collection. I was still steaming off 3-cent purple stamps on, picked up at the post office. So he came up to my house one day, and I had, when you steamed the stamps, you put them on a glass in a cabinet, a cupboard, and we had there. And then when they dried, you pick them off. And one of them had peeled off and dropped down into red cinnamon applesauce that my mother made. And so the purple turned red. And he saw that sucker and the red in my book and pile, and he said, I want that. So I said, well, you're willing to pay for it, you can have it. And he said, what do you want? I said, I want that transportation issue, that 1892 issue. They didn't have airplanes yet. They didn't have cars. They had some wagons and steamers. I still got that in my stamp collection. But anyway, Bill we came back from the war, and he and my best friend went to college together and took up marketing. He went up to Dayton-Hudson and became the manager of Dayton-Hudson store, and convinced them that they ought to buy Target, and they bought Target, and from then on it was just straight up. And he was the most self-effacing guy you ever met. I mean, he was well-spoken, but he never claimed anything, prideful or anything. And I saw in the magazine one time that he was the 120th most highly paid man in the country. And I didn't know, I didn't know if he was barely getting by. He became the first non-member of the Dayton family that ran the organization and made a whale of a lot of money. And he has supported Upper Iowa very generously. He and his wife have also done a lot for Fayette and Claremont and their hometowns. But he always had some, he thought I ought to run for president and such nonsense. But he was always very helpful to me, always very gracious, I should say. One day, I got word when I was out in California that he was seriously ill with maybe the last go-around of cancer. And he'd been fighting it off for 4 or 5 years, and as he donated, she and he donated millions of dollars to Upper Iowa to refurbish and reestablish the old campus, and it's beautiful if you get up there. Coming from Minneapolis, they were nuts about art, and so they've got several. They did a landscaping project, and it included several artists, various sculptors that often don't mean anything to guys that are not artistically inclined, but included in that was one for the entrepreneur, and he always told me that someday that he wanted to, whenever that was ready to be mounted and pay it, that he wanted to dedicate that to me. And I was out at a rainbow meeting in California, and a friend of ours called me and said, Bill's in the hospital. We think it's his last time. So I stopped at Denver, got off the plane, and called him, and he answered the phone. He was there in the hospital. Feeble as could be, but it sounded like he hadn't everything together. And he said, I'll tell you, Ted, he said, I want you to be the recipient of that dedication of the entrepreneur. Well, to me, he represented the entrepreneur, and maybe that's what he had in mind, that he could be in my shadow. But he did so much for so many on his own right that he picked me to be the recipient of that.
It's a great story. Yeah. Ted, we're probably running low on time here. Before we end this, I would like to have you show this photograph of your family. Tell us,
well,
how many children did you have, Ted?
We had 4.
Girls, boys?
2 of each.
2 of each.
All J's. Jim, Jeff, Julie, Janine.
What was your wife's name?
Shirley.
Shirley?
Shirley Storm. Yeah.
Can you get that, Alan?
I'm on it.
Okay.
This was at a wedding picture?
This is the wedding of we have 10 grandchildren, and this was the eldest and first to be married, and the only one to be married as of now. So we went up to Decorah. All of my kids, save one, went to Luther College because the coach at Upper Iowa told my brother, who lived next door, when he asked about why he wouldn't recruit my son Jeff, who played for Washington High School, and they were very successful. He played with Carl, with Skogman, and Darling, and those guys. And ended up playing 4 years at Luther. But that guy said I wouldn't have one of those Washington guys on my team. And so when I heard that, that was the end of it. But anyway, that's their daughter. And all of my grandchildren, save the most recent, have gone to college at Luther.
That's great.
And
That's great. Ted, you led a very fulfilling and colorful life. If you had to live it over again, would you do anything different?
no, I don't regret anything I ever did. I aspired to be a congressman, and I passed on that because my wife didn't want to move back to D.C. And but I could have been, probably. I've done a lot of politics in the meantime, and but outside of that, and everybody that now represents us is doing a good job, so I don't have any complaints. I don't regret it very much.
The Linn County Historical Society, the Cedar Rapids History Center would like to thank you very much for sharing your memories with us. It's been one terrific interview. Thank you very much.
Well, and it's been a pleasure to meet you guys and to see what you're doing. It's a great thing. And
Thank you.
generations will remember it.
Thank you. Your kids will